Hey everyone, it's obvious you guys are on top of this whole U.S.-Ukraine mineral deal thing, talking about moving fast.
Yeah.
Zelenskyy might be in D.C. by Friday, maybe even signing this thing already. Crazy, right?
Well,
Especially after all that tension in the negotiations last week. And now, bam, we have this CBS piece from literally yesterday, the 26th, with some pretty big updates. So let's deep dive into this, shall we? What's really going on here? What's interesting, and what could it mean for both the U.S. and Ukraine?
I guess pretty wild how fast this is all moving. Yeah, 1 minute it's a war of words, and then the next a handshake in D.C. Definitely feeling a sense of urgency here.
Oh, absolutely. Like, what's pushing this need for speed on both sides? Why are the U.S. and Ukraine both trying to get this done so fast?
Well, if you're Ukraine, it probably comes down to needing military support from the U.S., keeping that aid flowing. The CBS article even quotes one Ukrainian official saying this deal is how they make sure that keeps happening. So it's basically an economic agreement, but with some serious military stuff tied in.
So it's like this economic deal is leverage for military aid. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it definitely adds a whole new layer to the relationship. And the timing is really interesting too, right? Zelensky is supposed to be talking about future military aid with Trump during this visit. So yeah, this agreement's about economics on paper, I guess. But it's totally tied up with Ukraine's security needs and how much they depend on the U.S.
Okay, so you've got the war as a backdrop, and then this deal is evolving on the table. And CBS lays out the framework. And it looks like they've moved away from those earlier proposals. Remember that $500 billion demand from the U.S.?
Oh, yeah, that got some serious pushback. The idea was the U.S. gets $500 billion in profits from Ukraine's resources, basically as payback for all the help during the war. But Zelensky shot that down hard, said he didn't want to stick future generations of Ukrainians with that kind of debt.
Yeah, it seems like that's off the table now. The framework now is all about joint ownership of a fund for Ukraine's resources, with Ukraine contributing 50% of future profits. But what does joint ownership even really mean? Is that just fancy wording, or is there some kind of real power sharing going on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? They're selling it as this big collaboration. But, we got to look at the fine print. How are decisions going to be made? What's there to keep things transparent and accountable? We need to dig into the specifics to see who really has the control.
Right, because if it's 50-50 on paper, but the U.S. is calling the shots, that changes everything. And then there's the question of how much this deal is actually worth. Trump threw out $1 trillion. I don't know about you, but it sounds a little optimistic.
Yeah, that definitely needs a closer look. Ukraine does have a lot of minerals, especially those rare earth minerals everyone's talking about. But putting an exact dollar amount on that, tricky. It all depends on market prices, how much it costs to get the stuff out of the ground, and the infrastructure to actually get it from point A to point B.
So it's not as easy as saying, boom, $1 trillion worth of stuff right there in the ground. You got to factor in the logistics and how the global market actually works.
Exactly. And to really understand what's at stake, you got to get why everyone's so obsessed with these rare earth minerals in the first place. I mean, they're crucial for all sorts of technology. Everything from smartphones and electric cars to weapons and green energy. They're basically the building blocks of the modern world. So whoever controls them has a major strategic advantage.
Okay, so these minerals are a big deal.
Yeah.
Got it. But switching gears for a second, there's this whole thing with General Kellogg, Trump's special envoy, right? He was just in Ukraine last week, and that was right after that very public spat between Trump and Zelensky. Remember how things got a little heated?
Yeah, the timing of Kellogg's visit right after that is definitely interesting. And the fact that negotiations suddenly seem to be moving forward makes you think he might have played a big part in smoothing things over.
So was this like a calculated move by Trump? Send in the fixer to get the deal back on track? It kind of makes you wonder if those public jabs were all part of the plan.
Could be. But it also begs the question, why Kellogg specifically? What made him the right guy for such a delicate mission?
Well, he was national security advisor to Trump. And everyone knows he's got deep knowledge of the region. So maybe it was about sending someone with clout, someone who gets both the military and the diplomatic side of things, someone who can navigate all the security and economic interests at play.
Yeah, someone who could bridge that gap. But even with all this progress, there are still some pretty big question marks. Like, what about security guarantees for Ukraine? The CBS piece doesn't really touch on that.
That's huge. This whole deal with all the economic stuff, it's happening while there's a war going on. It's like the economic and military parts are totally intertwined. But are there actual concrete promises being made about security? Or is it all just implied? Makes you wonder if Zelensky's just hoping to lock those guarantees down when he meets with Trump.
That's definitely a possibility. And it brings up a much bigger question. What does all this mean for Ukraine's relationship with the U.S. down the road? Will it make them stronger? Or will it create a whole new kind of dependence?
So many layers to peel back here. You've got the deal itself, the strategic thinking behind it, the potential risks, and then the human element at the center of it all. There's so much more to talk about. Should we dig into these implications a little deeper?
Absolutely. There's a lot more to consider, especially how this deal might play out on the international stage.
Perfect. Let's take a minute to collect our thoughts.
Yeah.
And we'll pick up this thread right where we left off in part 2.
You know, it's kind of crazy how fast the whole tone shifted. Like 1 minute, Trump's calling Zelenskyy a dictator, and then the next, they might be shaking hands in D.C., all within a week. Feels almost staged, you know?
Right. Makes you think about those jabs from Trump. Was he really that frustrated, or was it just a way to put the pressure on?
Oh.
It definitely got everyone's attention, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And now that Zelenskyy is actually coming to D.C., the focus shifts to what this deal really means. You know, like what are the actual consequences, especially for Ukraine?
Exactly, because even if this deal gets Ukraine more military aid, it could also mean they end up depending on the U.S. even more. Is that the kind of relationship Ukraine wants? Or even needs?
That's the tough part for Ukraine, isn't it? They need the help right now to deal with Russia. That's no question. But depending too much on any white country, even an ally like the U.S., well, it comes with its own set of problems. It could limit their options diplomatically. And who knows what'll happen to U.S. foreign policy down the line. They could be left out in the cold.
It's a tough balancing act, for sure. And we haven't even talked about how Russia might react to all of this. Could this be seen as a provocation, something that pushes Russia and China even closer, or even makes the whole situation worse?
It's definitely possible. Russia's always seen Ukraine as being in their sphere of influence. And this deal, especially with American companies getting involved in Ukraine's resources, could feel like a direct challenge to that. We have to think about how this plays into the bigger picture in the region and what the unintended consequences might be.
Okay, so we've talked about the good stuff for Ukraine, the military aid, the economic boost. But what about the U.S. side of things? What's in it for Trump and his administration? Why are they so gung-ho about getting their hands on these Ukrainian minerals?
Well, there are probably a few reasons. First, remember those rare earth minerals we talked about? They're basically essential for all the high-tech stuff we rely on, everything from our phones to the weapons that keep the world in check. So having a steady supply of those minerals is a top priority for any major power, especially with the competition with China heating up. They're basically running the show when it comes to rare earths right now.
So this isn't just about some minerals in Ukraine. It's about the U.S. trying to level the playing field, get a leg up in this global resource race.
Exactly. And for the U.S., this deal is a chance to rely less on China for those crucial resources and maybe even become the leader in those key industries. It's about economic and technological power on the world stage.
And let's not forget the money American companies could make, investing in Ukraine's mining and all that. Think about the jobs, the exports, the boost to the U.S. economy.
Yeah, it's definitely a tempting opportunity. This deal lines up with a lot of U.S. interests, economic and strategic, all because of these super valuable rare earth minerals. It really shows how geopolitics and economics go hand in hand, especially when you're talking about resources this important.
Speaking of valuable, remember when Trump said this deal could be worth $1 trillion? Think there's any truth to that? Or is it just political hype?
$1 trillion does seem like a stretch, at least in the short term. It's hard to put an exact number on what Ukraine's minerals are really worth, but the real value depends on a bunch of things. Global demand, how much it costs to extract the stuff, and this is key, the infrastructure to actually get it out of the ground and into the market.
All right, it's one thing to have stuff underground, but it's got to be feasible to get it out and actually sell it.
Exactly. And that takes time, know-how, and a lot of investment.
So yeah, we should take those big numbers with a grain of salt. This isn't some quick fix for the U.S.'s economic or strategic problems.
Definitely not.
So there's definitely potential. But let's keep our expectations in check. It's almost never as simple as those big pronouncements make it seem. But you know, up until now, we've been focusing on the politics and the economics. What about the people? How does this affect everyday Ukrainians?
That's a really important point.
Wow.
This isn't just about abstract numbers and strategies. It's about real people in Ukraine. They're the ones living through this war, facing all these challenges and uncertainty. Their lives are on the line.
Exactly. We can't forget about that human side of things. We have to ask ourselves, how will this deal impact their lives? Will it bring peace and stability? Will it improve their lives? Will it help them rebuild after the war?
Those are the most important questions. And unfortunately, the hardest to answer. If the deal works out the way they hope, it could definitely have a positive impact. But there are also risks to think about.
Like what?
Well, there's the risk that Ukraine gets even more caught up in the conflict. Will this just make them rely on the U.S. even more for their security? And then there's corruption. That's been a big problem in Ukraine for a long time. A deal this big with so much money and resources involved could make those problems even worse. Unless everyone's super careful and transparent.
So it's not a simple equation. There's good and bad. And in the end, it's the people of Ukraine who will really feel the effects of this deal.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's so important to understand how complicated this whole situation really is. This isn't just about minerals and money. It's about people's lives, their hopes and fears.
Yeah, it's a story that's still being written. There's a lot we don't know yet. We don't know how this deal will actually turn out. But one thing's for sure. It's going to have a huge impact on Ukraine and the relationship with the U.S. We've covered a lot of ground here. How about we take a minute to think about everything we've talked about, and then come back to finish up our deep dive in part 3. Okay, we're back for the home stretch of our deep dive. We've gone over the deal itself, looked at the main players, weighed the pros and cons, but now for the big question. What does it all mean? What's the big takeaway from all this?
Well, I think this whole thing really shows how much the world is changing. We're seeing this big power struggle between the U.S. and China, and things like these rare earth minerals, they're becoming a big point of contention. This deal could be the U.S.'s way of securing their supply and relying less on China. They've got a pretty tight grip on the rare earth market right now.
So it's not just about Ukraine and their resources. It's about the U.S. making a move on the world stage, trying to get ahead in this resource game.
Exactly. And Ukraine, with all those valuable minerals, they're stuck right in the middle of this tug of war. It's a tough spot to be in, trying to balance their own needs with what their powerful allies like the U.S. want.
Yeah, it's like a high-stakes chess match.
Yeah.
And Ukraine's the most important piece on the board. And don't forget about Russia hanging back there in the shadows. How do you think they're going to react to all of this? Especially since they've got their own history with Ukraine, and they want those resources too.
Russia's a big question mark here. They've already shown they're not afraid to use force to get what they want in that region, and this deal could look like a direct threat to them. It's entirely possible this could make things even worse. Add more fuel to the fire.
So we're not just talking about some economic ups and downs here. This could really shake things up in Eastern Europe. This deal could have ripple effects way beyond Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. But I think it shows how connected everything is in global politics and economics these days. Something that happens over there can have a huge impact over here. It's all connected. We can't look at this deal on its own. It's part of this massive web of global power dynamics.
Okay, so let's switch gears for a minute and bring this back to you, our listener. We've given you a lot to think about, a lot of different viewpoints. Now we want to know what you think. Going back to those articles you shared with us, what parts of this deal stood out to you? What questions are you left with?
There are no easy answers here. This is a complicated situation. No clear winners or losers. This deal could be good or bad for the U.S. and Ukraine. And how it all shakes out depends on so many things. A lot of stuff is out of everyone's control.
Exactly. It's not black and white. It's a lot of gray areas. It's important to remember this isn't some isolated thing. It's all part of this bigger geopolitical puzzle. We're talking about alliances, changing countries, fighting over stuff, high stakes, maneuvering all over the place.
And that's what makes it so interesting, don't you think? We're watching history happen right in front of us. And the choices being made now will affect things for years to come.
Absolutely. So as you keep following this story, think about this. If this deal actually goes through, will it really make Ukraine stronger? Or will it just make them depend on the U.S. even more? What if this supposed lifeline turns into a chain that holds them back, limits their options on the world stage?
That's the big question, isn't it? Only time will tell. What's going to happen to Ukraine? Where do they fit in the world? Will they come out of this stronger and more independent? Or will they get sucked deeper into this power struggle between the big players?
Something to think about, right? Keep those questions in mind as we see how this all plays out. Things are changing fast, and there are sure to be some surprises along the way. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different corner of the world. But until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the complexities of our ever-changing world.